Coming up next, we're catching up with the butt-kicking, supernatural hunting Buffy Summers in the 1992 movie Buffy the Vampire Slayer.
Movie? Hello guys, welcome back to another Halloween themed Rewind Reviews episode. May not exactly look like a Halloween episode, but with my trusty sidekick, he's gone! As long as I bring him out every episode, at least it might actually start feeling like Halloween. And in this episode we're going to be looking back at a movie that came out in 1992, and it is a movie that I was quite surprised to actually learn even existed back when I first watched this film, because I did actually watch the series. I was quite familiar with the series, a lot of friends, family members knew about the series, but I didn't realise that Buffy the Vampire Slayer started out as a movie. The original Buffy the Vampire Slayer sees a teenager called Buffy Summers learning of her destiny as her generation's battler of vampires. Done a lot of vampire episodes this Halloween, might need to change that next week. Directed by Fran Rubel Kusi and written by Joss Whedon, the movie stars Christy Swanson, Donald Sutherland, Paul Rubens, Rutger Hauer, Luke Perry, Hilary Swank, Sasha Jensen and David Arquette. So yes, as I said a little bit earlier on, I wasn't aware that Buffy the Vampire Slayer actually started out as a movie. To me, it's always been a series. I'm familiar with Sarah Michelle Gellar, I'm aware of the series. I haven't watched the entire run of it. I've seen enough of it. I think I've seen up to like series 4. I've even started watching Angel as well. I need to catch up with them actually. But that's all I thought it was, and when I discovered it was a movie, it was genuinely a case of me just kind of flicking through the channels and I saw Buffy the Vampire Slayer listed and I was like, oh, I haven't seen that in a while, let's have a look at that. Clicked it on, I know. This doesn't look like Buffy the Vampire Slayer. I thought it was just me that didn't really realise this, but I got in touch with a few people and sort of talked and said that I'm going to be doing this episode, and the amount of them that came back and said, wait, it's a movie? So I'm really glad I'm not the only one. Just before I start this review, I do need to mention that I'm not really going to be holding back on what happens in this movie. I'm going to be talking more spoilery stuff, and I don't really think it's a movie that you can really sort of spoil too much, but if you are interested in seeing this movie and you don't want to know anything about it, I'd advise you not to watch this video. So starting off with the cast for this movie, this is a really star-studded cast. The lineup is genuinely making some huge names from the modern day. We've got people like Donald Sutherland, we've got Rutger Hauer, we've got Luke Perry, we've got Pee Wee Herman. We've even got a really brief cameo from Ben Affleck in this as well. I was really surprised actually seeing him, because this is actually the second time that I've watched this movie and I completely forgot he was even in this. That was a bit of a surprise when he showed up. I mean, in terms of performances, I think everybody's fine. I think that they do a fairly alright job with each of their roles. I like that with Donald Sutherland he just kind of play it quite straight, but I do think that maybe he sort of takes it a little bit too far, because there are times where he just kind of comes across as a little bit creepy, and I don't know whether it's the performance or the way that he was directed. I feel like they could have done a little bit more with him, because there isn't really an awful lot to him. We don't really find out too much about his backstory, so I feel like that could have been explored a little bit. But when it comes to the villains, I feel like their performances do seem to be a little bit more in tone with this movie. It seems like those actors seem to be completely aware what kind of movie that they're in, because they really play up the campy, cheesy side. They really get into it. They do look like they're having an absolute blast in this film. I mean, like when you see Lothos for the first time, he sort of looks like a bit of a Liberace kind of character, and like the first time that you really sort of get like a proper look at him, he's hovering in mid-air. There's like this young girl who's like looking up at him and he's there, and the next thing he's got this massive cape and he's like da-da! But I do feel like the performances are kind of balanced out very well. I do think that each of the three main villains that do appear in this are actually alright, but it can be really over the top. But when it comes to Buffy herself, I am a little bit more mixed. I think like pretty much everyone else in this movie, I do think Christy Swanson is fine in the role. I do like how she is able to balance the two different sides to the character, where she kind of comes across a bit like Alicia Silverstone in Clueless. I don't know what the character's name is, but that's kind of the vibe that you get when she's like just with her friends. She's almost a little bit unlikable as well, and I do appreciate that they do kind of try and set that up as much as possible, so that when the character starts changing, you do see that change throughout the movie. I mean, there's a scene early on where her and her friends are in a cinema and all they're doing is just blabbing throughout the entire thing. That is how you make me not like you. I love the movie going experience, and that is something that I absolutely hate. She is able to do the serious stuff, and she is able to balance those two characteristics really well. I do like that change. I do think that it is shown enough, but it is really fast, and I do think that that change is very rushed, because this movie is just under an hour and a half. There's a lot of characters and a lot of lore that you've got to try and introduce and develop as the movie goes on, and I don't think that it's quite the right amount of time for them to really sort of do that. It is quite a physical role as well, with Buffy being a cheerleader and the acrobatics that come into play whenever she's fighting the vampires, and I do think that it is handled very well. I don't think that it's like the most well choreographed stuff, and there's definitely moments where it does look a lot like a stunt double. It's not as bad as like the TV series could be, where it's like just like the twirls and it's like very obviously a stunt double. But it's okay, and I do think that Christy Swanson is fine in the role. There are definitely times where I feel like they could have extended out a few scenes with her, because there are definitely moments where it does feel like there were things trimmed out. Like there seems to be a lot of development moments. I think that if they sort of let things linger a little bit more, let scenes kind of play out a little bit more, I think we could have seen a bit more of her character. Like, I know it's supposed to be a comedy, but I still feel like you need to kind of ground it enough, and I feel like having maybe a few scenes where she's coming to terms with the fact that she's just basically like killed people, I think that might sort of hit her a little bit more, because people don't really seem that phased about vampires in this film. I just feel like it could have done with maybe a few more moments like that. The series definitely does do that, and it does add a lot more to the character. It is so hard trying not to compare the two, because it is the exact same character, it's written by the exact same person. I don't really think that there's anybody who will say that the film version of Buffy is better than the TV series version of Buffy, but if they just spent a little bit more time developing her, I think that this could have been a bit more of a debate. I think Pike's quite fun as well. There might be a bit of a Spike influence in here somewhere. It does have like a similar sort of look and sort of vibe to him, and I wonder if maybe there was some sort of influence there. I do think he's an okay character, but similarly with most of the others, there isn't really an awful lot of time to really sort of develop him, and especially when it comes to the romance between him and Buffy, I do feel like it is a bit forced, and I do feel like they don't really have enough time to really sort of develop it and build it up a little bit. Because as I said, this movie is just under 90 minutes long, and that is way too short to introduce everything that this movie is trying to do. Because sometimes there are even scenes where it sort of feels like they're kind of building up to something, and then it just cuts and then it's to the next scene. So it definitely feels like there are sequences that are missing, so potentially there is a longer version of this film out there, but I don't know how true that is. And there's even a lot of like time jumps as well, because there's like scenes of like Buffy training up, and you're not quite sure how long has really sort of passed, because it sort of kind of blurs together until one of the teachers that's called her into detention says it's been like 3 weeks and you've started being a bit funny. And I just feel like they could have added that a little bit smoother, or at least just make it a little bit more obvious. It also would have benefited the villains a little bit more in this, because it would have given them a bit more time to being developed and fleshed out, and I feel like there could have been a bit more of an escalation. They would have not only been able to have told like a slightly longer story, but potentially they could have had a follow-on movie or more movies in the future and had the villains develop across more. Like start introducing the lore and mythology into the first movie, and have like Lothos being in the background kind of manipulating things, and he doesn't really sort of make a proper appearance until like towards the end of the final battle, sort of leading into the next one where he would be the main threat. But have this one kind of be more like David Arquette's movie in a way, where he's been turned and Buffy's friends with him, and she's got to come to terms with her friends being turned into a vampire, so she has to sort of understand that these things will hurt absolutely everyone, including her own friends. And then when it comes to the lore itself, I think that they could have fleshed that out a little bit more as well, because like even when it comes to the series, it's a little bit flimsy at times, the way that it's just like the one Slayer and that's it. It never feels like there really could be a bit more of an expansion to it, like maybe it's more of a prophecy rather than like, no, it's got to be this one person throughout all the time. Because I also don't really understand the whole bit of like Donald Sutherland saying that he can't interfere in what's going on, and yet you've got Pike quite happily getting involved and stabbing vampires as well, so he's getting involved. So I just feel like they could have done a bit more to it. I'm aware that the TV series did go into this a lot more, it did kind of develop it a lot more. That's kind of the benefit of having a TV series over a film, because the concept and ideas in this movie are really good and interesting, but you need time to really develop them. And speaking of time, this movie takes place in the 90s, and it is very much a 90s movie. Because we've got like the dialogue, which is very much like a 90s teen sort of film, where it's like they have a very specific way of talking. I wasn't somebody who was a teenager in the 90s, so I can't say for 100% that this is how people talked, but it always feels like the adult writers are a bit like,
I'm with it. I'm hip.
because like most of that style of dialogue sort of takes place during like all the scenes with Buffy and her friends, where they're all sort of talking. It's like, what's the sitch? Totally. It just sort of feels a little bit awkward. And then even like the fashion sense that people have got in this movie, where it's got like those really big bright colours and the jumpsuit looking things, and honestly throughout the entire movie I was just going, so this does feel like a bit of a time capsule of that sort of era where it was still sort of in the 80s era, but it was the 90s, so it's sort of right in that middle. So it does feel a little bit dated. I don't think there was a very big budget for this film, so there's not a lot of big extravagant things that do happen in it. I do think that this is like an extended version of an episode, but it's just a lot brighter and it leans into the 90s era a lot more. And that does kind of feed into quite a few of the action sequences in this movie, because as I said, like, there are definitely times when it does kind of feel like a TV series, to the point where like the style of fighting that they really sort of go for when it comes to Buffy, it is very similar to what they had in the series. I don't know whether that was intentional or it's just because that's what they were able to do, because like lots of flips and kicks and all sorts, and I do feel like if they really had sort of put a bit more money into this, I feel like they really could have gone just a little bit more. I do appreciate that it is quite grounded, that they do sort of stay away from wire work, they don't push it too far. Even like the vampires, they're not too strong, they're not too overpowered in the way that a lot of other movies are with them, but they really could have done a bit more. And I feel like even like the effects in this film as well, there's not much. Most of the effects are literally just like wire work, and that's really it. There's no like CG or anything. It's kind of is before CG in a way. So like whenever Buffy goes up against any vampires and she stabs them, and there's no dusting effects whatsoever, it's just straight up like. So it could potentially make this one a little bit more grisly than some of the other ones, but this is still rated at 12, PG-13, and I feel like it does kind of get away with that. And a big reason for that is the comedy, because this is more of a comedy than it is a horror movie. It's a really weird mixture of the two. It is trying to be a comedy. There are a lot of comedic moments. It can be quite funny at times, but it can be a little bit unintentional. Sometimes you're laughing because of how bad the jokes actually are. Because this is what I mean when I say that some of the actors kind of understood what sort of movie it is that they were part of, because I feel like the people who were working on this movie aren't quite getting the kind of humour that a movie like this really sort of needed. Because like the cheesier stuff and the more over the top elements, I do feel like those can be quite funny at times, and as I said, it can be rather unintentional. I do feel like the performances are a big part of that, because like Paul Rubens is great. The character's not brilliant, and I do feel like there are moments where he is a little bit over the top, but he does get some of the funniest scenes in this, and I think he really does steal the show. And his death scene is one of the most awkward moments in the movie, but that's what makes it as funny as it is. So I do find myself still laughing whenever I see that scene, but it is really awkward how it is handled. Because that's what I mean when I say it needs to kind of balance the humour a lot more, because it is trying to be funny, but then sometimes I think it sort of goes a bit too far in that direction. Because this is still a movie that does deal with vampires, it does deal with the darker elements of the supernatural worlds, and I do feel like what it needed to have was a balance of the comedy and horror, and I feel like it doesn't do that very well. It's nowhere near scary enough to be considered a horror movie, but it's not funny enough to be considered a comedy, so it's sort of like in this really sort of weird middle ground. You can get an idea of what it is that they were trying to go for, or what direction they wanted to go with it, but I don't feel like it's really pulled off in the way that it really should have. The series is where that really comes into its own, because that show could be really funny, it could be really over the top, but then it would switch and there'd be episodes that are absolutely terrifying. But it all works because it's given time to develop and have the characters interacting in pretty believable ways, and have the characters actually reacting to things realistically as well. Because as I said, like, there are scenes where like, there's vampires attacking the school, and like, yeah, some people sort of freak out, but nobody seems that phased that there's just been a vampire attack. I mean, even like Pike doesn't really seem bothered that his best friend's being turned into one. Because like, prime example, one of the basketball players gets turned into a vampire and he actually shows up for one of the matches. I feel like there is actually a really good idea for them to sort of contrast the humour and tension. Like, it is quite funny that he does show up, and he's got the weirdest way of talking about it. He's all sort of like that. But at the same time, it's a vampire in the middle of this school, and I feel like that should be the cause for just a little bit of tension. I just don't feel like it's really done well. So I really do wish that they had balanced out the tones a little bit and did a little bit more with it. For the music, it's a bit of an interesting mixture, because we have Carter Burwell who's doing the main music for the movie, and I don't think it's really the most memorable. I mean, it was literally a day ago since I watched this movie and I can't remember a single theme in this film. It works well enough within context of the movie, and I do like where the themes are sort of come into play, but it really is not memorable at all. The songs, however, I actually do quite like. Again, absolute time capsule for the 90s, but I really do like the songs that they do choose for this movie. They do fit within the scenes that they are used. I feel like they are so much more memorable than the actual music. The theme song for the TV show and even the one for Angel are both very iconic TV themes, but I'm really disappointed that we didn't have something as memorable or as good for this movie. Overall, I have fun with this movie, but it's not one that I really sort of want to rewatch that much. I don't feel like this is a very good movie. There is a lot of potential, there is definitely a lot of great elements to this that are just not utilised in the way that they really should have. The cast and concepts being like the main focus of that for me. There are definitely a lot of problems that I do see with it. I do feel like this is a movie that I feel like might actually be a guilty pleasure for a lot of people, because it does have fun elements. It can be unintentionally funny. Some of the funnier scenes actually genuinely are funny. I sort of feel like it's got a bit of a student film kind of feel to it, just like some of the way that certain sequences play out. I do feel like if maybe you get a few of your friends together and have some like drinks or something, I think that you could have a fun time with this film. For like casual viewers, I think that this movie you might enjoy, but I'm not quite sure if you will. If Clueless with vampires sounds appealing to you, I think you'll enjoy it. That being said, I do feel like if you are somebody who is a big fan of the TV series who hasn't seen this movie, I do recommend having a look at it, because there are so many elements from this movie that do actually kind of make an appearance in the series. Especially the first series, because there is definitely a lot of elements that are carried over, even though I feel like the series is actually more of a sequel to the film rather than like a remake of it. It's kind of like a Daredevil in the MCU sort of situation, where it's kind of a follow-on but it kind of isn't. They do acknowledge elements of the movie in the series, like they do mention like the dance and the stuff that got her to go to the new location. I really forgot it was called Sunnydale for a second then. It's even like got the epic voiceover at the beginning. It's not Anthony Head. I mean, I love Anthony Head. I think he's absolutely brilliant as Giles. But like the voiceover that they have at the beginning of this is absolutely epic, and I think that's how you start this. It even has like a few little mistakes and all sorts in the background. Like one of the first scenes of Buffy and her friends in the shopping mall is like an overhead shot, and you see one of the microphones in the background on the floor. That's the problem that some movies today still have. But outside of that, nothing else is really kind of carried over. It does acknowledge that she did have another watcher, but that's really it. There's nothing else that actually makes an appearance. I don't think Pike makes an appearance. I don't think anything's really sort of acknowledged that really sort of happens in this, so it does feel like a completely new thing that you could just watch on its own. You could watch this movie and get the origin story, because they even kind of jump to the past a little bit, and you do see a little bit of like the older Slayers before Buffy becomes the new one. So it is definitely worth checking out for that reason if you are a fan of the series. So with all that being said, it's not a good movie by any means, but there are definitely elements that I do feel like a lot of people will enjoy. And for that reason, I'm going to give this movie a 5 out of 10. Well, that's pretty much everything I've got to say for today's episode, so thank you so much for watching. If you like this content, please like and subscribe, hit the notification button to keep up to date on everything that's going on this channel. If you've seen the movie, let me know down in the comments what you think about it. I'd love to hear from you. And also if you have any suggestions for future Rewind reviews that I should do, let me know down in the comments, whether it's films, TV, games. I'd love to hear them. Thank you once again for watching, and I'll see you next time on Rewind Reviews. See you guys.